Okay, good evening everybody and welcome to this first of around 10 inaugural lectures through 2017-18 academic year. Just to introduce myself, I'm Professor Mark Ormerod, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost here at Keele, and it's a great pleasure to welcome such a good turnout. And in particular, in addition to welcoming Keele colleagues, great pleasure to welcome external attendees, so some professional colleagues from the health service, and also in particular Pauline's husband and children and friends who will get to see their wife or mum talk probably for the first time in some shape. So inaugural lectures, the purpose of inaugural lectures is firstly to really, so the new professor, whether that's an externally appointed professor or someone that's been promoted internally, to talk about their area of expertise. And secondly, to profile Keele and the work in the discipline, which in this case is nursing. So Pauline comes to this evening via a relatively unusual route compared with a more traditional academic professor. In 1979, Pauline started her orthopaedic nursing certificate at Standish Hospital in Gloucestershire. And then in 1984, registered as a general nurse, or qualified as a general nurse at Cheltenham General Hospital, and worked in trauma, orthopaedics, and then intensive care. Then in 1987, she did a 6-month intensive care nursing qualification at Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, and in 1987 worked at the Gloucester Royal Hospital in intensive care and surgery, while studying alongside this at Bristol Polytechnic. 1990, she obtained a teaching qualification at Cardiff University, and in 1991 became a nurse tutor at the then United Midlands College of Nursing, which subsequently became part of Wolverhampton University in 1995, when nursing was taken in effectively into the university system. And in 1999, Pauline took an MA in medical ethics at Keele, where her thesis was on life and death decision making in intensive care units. That obviously inspired Pauline 8 years later to come to Keele, where she took up the role of Director of Undergraduate Programmes in Nursing and Midwifery. In 2010, Pauline was then appointed as Head of the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Keele. And then last year, Pauline was appointed to the Professor of Nursing, based on her achievements around leadership and professional practice. I think it's fair to say that Pauline's made tremendous contribution to the School of Nursing and Midwifery over the time that she's been head of school, transformed the school from where it was in 2010 to being one of the top-ranked nursing and midwifery schools in the United Kingdom, and one of Keele's highest-ranking schools in terms of its league table position. And Pauline's really led that transformation. She's also increasingly taken on wider university roles over that time, including around quality assurance and student success. And a key focus throughout Pauline's academic career has been on curriculum development and innovation and the student experience, and especially in relation to practice learning, simulation, retention and resilience. I'm not going to say too much more because I think that will come out in Pauline's lecture, but I think everyone here today appreciates that the health service in the United Kingdom is under a lot of pressure, and nurses are very much on the front line of that healthcare environment, so a very challenging environment, and clearly a profession that's seen huge changes over the many years that Pauline's been engaged with it, which I think will unfold tonight. So just a little bit about Pauline's external profile. That Pauline's been a member of the Council of Deans of Health since 2010, providing expertise around student retention, and she's an active member of the Royal College of Nursing Education Forum, and took up the chair of that in December 2015, and is in a position where she's now influencing nursing education on a national scale, and is very committed to developing a vibrant and engaged forum that reaches out to its wider membership, and that was one of the reasons for Pauline's promotion to a chair. So Can I therefore formally welcome Professor Pauline Walsh, Professor of Nursing, and invite her to present her inaugural lecture, Reflections on the Past, Present and Future of Nurse Education, a Personal Journey.
Thank you, Mark. First of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be stood up giving this inaugural lecture. Something that I probably never would have dreamed that I would have done in my childhood years. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and it's really, really great to see so many faces, if not a bit daunting. And in particular, I'd like to thank my family who've come quite a long way. So you'll see as I go through my presentation that we're quite a large family, and to have 6 siblings here this evening is really, really great. So I suppose I have to think about, what did I want to put in this? And it's quite difficult to know how much to put in or quite where to pitch it. But what I'm going to try and do is do a little bit about the history of nursing education, and then tell you about some key things that I've been involved in along the way. But I thought to get us there, first of all, we need to just think a little bit about what is nursing. So I wanted to just put this quote up, really. And this is the International Council for Nursing's definition of what nursing actually is. And I'll just read it out for you, because I'm not certain how easy it is to read in the audience. But it says that nursing encompasses autonomous and collaborative care of individuals of all ages, families, groups and communities, sick or well, and in all settings. Nursing includes the promotion of health, prevention of illness, and the care of the ill, disabled and dying people. It also involves advocacy, promoting a safe environment, research participation in shaping health policy, and inpatient and health systems management and education are all part of a nurse's role. The Royal College of Nursing in 2014 also provided a definition, and they talk about nursing as the use of clinical judgment in the provision of care to enable people to improve, maintain or recover health, to cope with health problems, and to achieve the best possible quality of life, whatever their disease or disability, until death. So I think you can really get from both of those definitions that nursing is a profession that's really about the whole person, and is about trying to, whatever situation that person is in, help them to make the most and cope with whatever they are having to do. So a little bit about some of the, we have to put a little bit of history in here, and you may recognise some of the faces. So we have Mary Keele and Florence Nightingale, who were both prominent nurse leaders who were involved in supporting the Crimean War. But the one that you may not know so much about is Agnes Hunt. And Agnes Hunt was somebody who actually had scoliosis herself, and set up a small nursing home for children in Shropshire, which is why I was quite interested in this. Initially in Shrewsbury, and she was under the care of a surgeon called Mr. Jones, and she persuaded him to come and actually treat, one day a week, come to her hospital and help treat the children there. And eventually that developed into them setting up a hospital, and that hospital eventually moving to Oswestry, which is now the Robert Jones and Agnes Hunt Hospital in Oswestry. So actually within our own locality, the area that we have our provision, we have quite an incredible nurse who, until I was really looking at this, I hadn't realised that connection, and that's something we should celebrate. So just a little bit about where it's come from. So in 1916, the RCN was founded, and then in 1919 is when registration of nursing first started to happen, and we had the General Nursing Council. Then in 1940, so you can see I'm skipping huge jumps of time here because we can't go through every single thing. But there was a 2-year state-enrolled nurse training formalised in 1940. The other key thing that happened was around the time of the war, nurses gained officer status in the services, and actually that also prompted when they came out of wanting to be working at a different level. And then in 1951, male nurses were allowed. So that takes us up to the 60s. So I have to say it, a little bit about me needs to come in now, because this is where I become involved. Clearly I didn't start my nursing in 1960, but I was born in the 1960s. I was born in Cheltenham and was the daughter of Nora and Paddy. So I've got some photographs here of my mum and dad, and I believe that little baby is me at my christening. But my parents were Irish, and so they moved over to England in their early 20s. But in Ireland, they came from very, very rural farming backgrounds, and actually didn't necessarily have particularly good start in life. My dad was born in a workhouse, and one of the workhouses that's been in the BBC News over the last few years. So that's mum and dad, and you know, they are what shaped us, really. And then this is the sibling. So can you guess which one I am? I am this one here. And as you can see, my sister Mary, who sat down there at the front, is holding my hand. And that actually sums things up, really. Mary went on holding my hand for quite a long time when I was a child. And I put the other photograph in because I think it's fairly obvious by now that actually that's me with the pigtails. And I just thought, that's such a lovely little photograph, really. And so, you know, I came from a family where we had a lovely childhood. All these brothers and sisters, life was fantastic in my house at home. We were never short of friends because it was much easier for everyone else to come to us than for us to go to them. So I have lots and lots of fond memories of all of my friends coming round, and it just being chaos a lot of the time. But a chaotic, loving childhood that, you know, I think really set me up in terms of understanding how to be with people. And I think I get a lot of my ability to work with people from my childhood, from my family life, and from the experiences I've had. So we're a mixed bunch, you know, had different types of interests and different things. In terms of my schooling, I went to what was then a secondary modern school. Probably not the best school in terms of providing opportunities from an academic perspective, and certainly one that wouldn't necessarily have had the ambition for me to be stood here today. However, and I don't know when I wanted to be a nurse. I think some of my brothers and sisters say you always wanted to be a nurse, but I don't really remember that. But I do remember that I'd finished school, I was 16, and you know, suddenly it was, well, what am I going to do? And I didn't actually have the qualifications to become a nurse at the time. So I am your real classic widening participation student here. And so I took what was known as the DC test at that time. So it was a national entrance test for people who didn't actually have the relevant qualifications. And that started a journey that's been amazing. So I passed the DC test and became a nurse. So as Mark mentioned, the first place that I became a nurse was I did my orthopaedic nursing certificate. And this is a photograph of Standish as I remember it. It's out in the middle of nowhere near Stroud in a little place called Stonehouse. And it's an old infectious diseases type of hospital. It was a wonderful experience. The patients that we used to look after, you know, it was a very different pace to the world it is today. It was all elective, so there were no trauma patients or anything like that. But we did nurse quite a lot of TB patients, and so patients with TB of the spine who would be in plaster cast really the whole of their body. And that was quite a challenge to help someone in that position be motivated, and cope with their condition. But you can see from the picture there's lots of French windows. So we thought nothing of just wheeling all the beds out into the sunshine. And yeah, as you can imagine, it was a really positive place to be. So of course, in any of these things, there's that dreaded photograph, which I'm going to have to show. The one of me as a student nurse when I finished my orthopaedics and I went to Cheltenham General to do my general training. And look at the size of the cohorts then. All of you who teach our nursing students now, it's a bit different, isn't it? So there were 13 of us in our cohort. And yes, we wore the starched aprons and everything. But and the education was so different in some ways, and yet some things are just the same as they are today. So looking at the 1970s and 80s then, some of the things that happened nationally was there was something called the Briggs Committee, which identified that actually there should be nursing degrees. So believe it or not, you could actually do a degree in nursing in 1972. It's just there weren't many universities that did it. But, you know, I've worked with colleagues who've similar age to me who have done that degree in nurses, maybe places like Edinburgh, you know, places like that. So there has always been that ability to have a degree in nursing. And around the time that this happened, there was all of this stuff, well, they won't want to remain in clinical practice. But actually the evidence afterwards showed that they were the ones who did stay in clinical practice. Then we had the United Kingdom Central Council and the National Boards for England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland developed. And then we had something called clinical grading, and I'm sure most people who work in the health service know what that was like. So it was when they started to make some national standards around how we should clinically grade people. And then during that time also, the enrolled nurse was abolished. Now, again, there's lots of differing opinions about whether that was a good or bad thing. So then you can see on the other side what I did during and up to the very end of the 80s. So, you know, some things I did when I qualified as a general nurse, I was awarded the newly qualified prize for nursing, which was a new thing. And I was given some money to go and do a study. But, you know, nursing at that time really had no idea about research or anything like that. So I was given the award and then just said, there you go and do it. So I decided to look at the needs of newly qualified nurses, and I went off around the country meeting directors of nursing and actually talked about what should we do, and came back and made some suggestions which were then implemented in the trust about establishing a newly qualified staff nurse development programme. And so that was my first experience of sort of finding out about things and learning about things. As you can see then, I did specialised in intensive care, did a specialist course and then went to work at Gloucester Royal Hospital. And as so often happens, I then had a one-year secondment to the School of Nursing at Gloucester Royal Hospital, and that changed my direction. I just loved being with students, and I just loved that whole thing about education. So I decided that actually that's what I wanted to do. Had a great year at Cardiff University, fully funded by the English National Board for Nursing. You wouldn't get that these days. You know, I was paid to be there, and did my teaching course with a group of people that came from all sorts of different backgrounds. So, you know, we used to do practice lessons, so they'd give a lesson to the little small tutor group that we had. So I did things like I learned the history of Welsh politics, the Labour Party. I learned things about law, about German, all sorts of different things. And it was a really positive experience. So then I moved to what's now known as Wolverhampton University, and things started to change. So we had Project 2000, which was probably a really pivotal moment in nurse education, I think. Throughout then the time, there are other things that have happened, but I want to just spend a little bit of time on Project 2000. So the idea around Project 2000 that we would look at how we educated and trained nurses slightly differently. And for the first time, there was a national standard that it had to be a diploma in higher education. Up until this point, that it wasn't an academic accredited course. And yet, if you talk to people who did their training before Project 2000, we still had to study, we still had to work hard. You know, you didn't just learn nothing, you did do lots of things. But this was the first time it actually did that. So it took it from an apprenticeship style into a more university education focused style. So there was more theoretical content, and the idea was also to change the focus from doing everything around ill health and illness to looking at health first and thinking about how you could promote health, and then also looking at illness. There were shorter placements which started later in the course, and this is probably the crux of some of the difficulties that we've or debates that we've had over time. And then the other big thing was that students were what we call supernumerary. It's a word you can never find in the dictionary, but it is there. And there was Project 2000 brought in this notion of what they call observational placements. I think as a profession we got this really wrong. I don't disagree with Project 2000 at all, but what I think we did is we thought supernumerary and observational meant students aren't allowed to do anything. So what happened is students would go out onto placements and people would say, oh, but you're on an observational placement, so you can't do anything. So students previously would have gone out there, would have been stuck in, would have been doing the actual care, doing all the different things, and suddenly this misunderstanding of what was meant by this meant students were no longer able to do that. And I think it was never intended for it to be like that, but the way it was implemented, I think, was part of a problem. The other thing it did is it brought in, up until this point, you did a general nurse training. Occasionally you could do a dual registration, so you could do, say, your general nursing and a children's nursing, but it would take you 4.5 years, something like that. But at this point, we had the first time when actually we had an 18-month common foundation, and then students went into a branch programme, and we had four branches: learning disability, adult nursing, mental health nursing, and children's nursing. Again, in my personal view, that was a mistake. I think, you know, we've tried to specialise our nurses too soon. And of course, what then happened is all the post-registration specialist courses fizzled out because they weren't needed, so people thought. The other thing that happened with that is the level of study for qualified staff. So what it did actually do was suddenly bring in a huge amount of universities needing to develop diploma of nursing for qualified staff, so they could be at the same academic level as the students that they were assessing in practice. Up until this point, probably a little bit before it, and I'm sure there'll be people in the audience who know the exact date, we had what we called the clinical link, the clinical tutor. So somebody who would go out with the students and work alongside them in clinical practice, but wasn't a member of that team, you know, wasn't part of the numbers to care for patients. And that really died out with this. And what started to happen was this perceived split between education and clinical practice. And because after Project 2000 was introduced, in 1995, as Mark mentioned, all nurse training had to come into universities to be delivered. So those of us that were working in hospitals as nurse tutors suddenly then had to transfer to become lecturers in university. So it meant that there was this perceived distance between practice and university. So I think Project 2000 really was pivotal in our current journey where we are now. And then you can see on the left, your left, a number of things that also happened during the 90s. We had the first nurse prescribing with the district nursing and health visitors. Nurse education moved to higher education, and then people started to think that maybe this Project 2000 course wasn't quite right. There were problems with it. So we had a new curriculum, which I'll mention to you, starting to be looked at. But it started off with a review of nurse education. And those of us in nurse education, we feel like we're constantly being reviewed. You know, there's always a new review going on to set a new set of standards. Lots of new roles developed for nurses, and in 2003 what is now our Nursing and Midwifery Council, so the statutory regulatory body that governs nurses, midwives, health visitors and all the other specialist areas, was established. And in 2004 they developed some new standards of proficiency. So against that backdrop, I was working at Wolverhampton University. We had large cohorts, and that's why I think it's so lovely here, because the sizes are much smaller. At Wolverhampton, we were on originally 5 separate sites, and we used to have, say, a nursing intake of, I don't know, probably 600 students. So it was a lot to manage. And also, that meant sort of 23, 25 NHS organisations to liaise with. And that was a real problem, because we'd lost some of our relationships. So one of the things that I did, my role at the time was the Principal Lecturer for Practice and Innovation, is that I worked with what was then the Strategic Health Authority to say, we need to do something about this. We need to have people in the trust who are our key liaison people who can help us to manage the situation in practice. So I was responsible for the very first ever practice placement manager roles, which we piloted across the Black Country, and then since our national, they're everywhere now. They might be called slightly different things. In our locality, we call them clinical placement facilitators. But that was something that at the time was, no one else was doing it. And the really amazing thing was the SHA agreed to fund them. They were all interviewed by me along with another body. So you can imagine I did a lot of interviewing for a short time. But we brought them together as a group. So right across the Black Country, we started to develop and build some consistency around what was happening. And this culminated in some work with a particular trust around how do we actually develop tripartite collaboration to looking at this developing practice learning. So we did a lot of work around looking at what does a trust need to have in place to manage practice learning. And then we also looked at, it's not very easy to see that on the right, but what could we do in a university to make sure that we were blending this experience? And so we did those two things together to try and enable students to understand the clinical elements and apply theory to practice. So then a couple of other things I did at Wolverhampton is mentorship. The people that supported and assessed the students out in clinical practice was variable. And, mentors were people who were registered nurses and midwives working full-time in their placement setting and never got any time to do it, really. And so I was involved in a couple of projects to try and think, how can we help mentors understand what it is they need to do? And one of the things we did is and it, you know, it sounds probably a bit old hat now, but we developed a CD-ROM for mentors. Now, of course, it would just be directly online and it would all be, but at the time, the online learning platforms weren't there. And then the other thing was about, there's always been this great big debate in nursing about what should a student learn, what skills should they do. And so we were coming up to developing a new curriculum. And so I did a project where I looked at what should students be taught in terms of their clinical skills. And we did work with practitioners out there in all of the trusts at all sorts of different levels, so mentors, ward managers, matrons, everything, and students themselves, and then people who worked in education. And we came up with, if you like, a template for what we needed to put in our curriculum. At the same time, in those days, the Strategic Health Authority used to be quite generous in terms of funding things. And at Wolverhampton, I managed to secure significant funding to appoint some part-time clinical skills facilitators. So the SHA paid for them, the trust didn't have to pay for them, and the university didn't have to pay for them. And they worked half of their week with us in the university and half of their week in practice. And that was, again, a really positive thing. So then in 2004, we had another set of standards, which meant we had to completely redo the curriculum again. And this time, they realised that an 18-month common foundation was a bit too long. So that got moved to 1 year. They realised that actually maybe the balance between time spent in university and time spent in clinical placements was not quite right. So that got moved to a 50-50 split. And that's when they introduced the idea of a 3-month practice placement at the end of the course. And at this time, we were starting now to increase the amount of technology and simulation, and you know, as depicted in the images there. So then I came to Keele. So what's happened while I've been at Keele? There's been yet another review of nursing education. And in 2010, a new set of standards came out, which I'll mention in a bit. We've had the Francis report, which has been a pivotal point in the NHS's history. I think this will definitely go down as. So the inquiry into care at Mid Staffordshire. And that's influenced every curriculum that we've had. Coming out of that has been something called Compassion in Nursing and the 6 C's, which is something that's spread nationally around trying to, I suppose, really generate compassionate leadership. That's the sort of terminology that we use now. We had an all-graduate profession start, and then what we've also seen is a reduction in the commissions for student places. Hence the nursing shortage right now. We, in my belief, can actually partly attribute to the fact of when they reduced our student numbers by 20-25%. And so, you know, it's always been this political thing where how many nurses you can train goes like this in peaks and troughs. And so what you can see on the right is a number of things that I've been involved in at Keele. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but it just shows that, you know, a lot of it really has been around the student experience, how can we keep students, and how can we give them a positive learning environment. But what I did focus on, one of the first things I focused on when I came to Keele, was looking at what the level of attrition of the nursing programmes were at the time. And in my view at the time, they were a little bit high compared to what we would want them to be. And so I started working around the notion of retention. And at the time, in 2006, the Nursing Standards Survey said that about 25% of students don't finish their course. Now, obviously, that's variable. In some areas, this was higher than that, in other areas, lower. But it was enough to say, is this okay? The funding arrangements started to change because initially, if the student started the year, then you got paid at the beginning of the year by the SHA and you'd get the whole money for the year. They soon realised that actually, why are we doing this when not all the students stay? So they brought in that you would have your payment staggered over the year and you'd only be paid for the number of students on the course at the time. And there was meant to be a financial penalty if your attrition went above 13%, and that's still, if you like, the golden number is 13%. So it was really all about, from the SHA and NHS's point of view, wanting to strive to see value for money. But one of the big problems was there was a real anomaly in how the attrition was calculated from one strategic health authority to another, despite there being a national formulary, but it still was interpreted differently. So I got involved and I was asked to represent the West Midlands higher education institutions on a national group, and that was really quite interesting. And it was a mixed group of university staff, SHA staff and NHS Trust staff. Some useful documents come out of that, and one of the things was around a document around managing attrition rates for student nurses. I was involved in a national workshop with the Council of Deans of Health, and the literature that was around was really helpful in us moving forward. So we could see that there are lots of reasons why students leave a programme, but the three key areas are it's something to do with the student themselves, something to do with the course, or actually they don't want to be in that profession, or we don't want them in the profession because they've failed or they don't demonstrate the right behaviours and values. And in March 2009, this was in the School of Nursing, our reasons for leaving. And what struck me at the time was 55% was wrong career choice. That's high, so there was something we could do about that. So we started looking at what are the protective factors that the literature says that will help protect students. And so we know that there was all the things on here, how looking at their motivation, goal-centred and the notion of resilience, making sure that they've got academic integration, early course preparation, socialising into the workplace, and a key thing was the support during that first placement. That seems to have been a really crucial thing. And then having the right personal support and the right personal tutor systems. So I did some work around what could we do, and again, really looking at some of these things about organisational commitment, so getting the school on board, getting them so they understood our figures, so that they knew some of the things to be doing. And I worked with some colleagues from Nottingham University, and we particularly looked at that first placement area. Another thing that I did at the time, and again, things move on, don't they? So now they use different things. But I did this project where it was funded by the SHA, looking at how can we enhance applicants' understanding of the reality of the programme they're coming to study. And so we did three things: some videos for each profession, which included a student, a practitioner and a service user, some career champions and some taster experiences. And it was quite interesting because when we evaluated them, people who'd already worked in a care setting said they still learnt things by watching the videos. The other thing that came out of the work around attrition and retention, and it's something that then got adapted within the school, and Abby's here today and she was part and parcel of putting this together, was the student support and monitoring tool that's embedded into our programme. And it's about trying to identify those that are at risk in any way and then managing them. So it's sort of a risk-based approach. So the current programme, we have its degree level. We've removed the common foundation, so now it's generic and field content throughout the 3 years. We're allowed to use 300 hours of simulated practice instead of practice hours, and we have to have a sign-off practice period at the end. But the move to an all-graduate profession caused us some problems. And the challenges were, at the time, you will have heard it in the press, why do nurses need to have a degree? I feel really passionately about this, that nurses in today's world do need to have a degree, and what is wrong with them having a degree? Why shouldn't they have a degree? So there was all sorts of stuff about, you know, nursing students are too posh to wash. Well, you talk to our students, that's not what they say, that's not how they feel. They have the same beliefs and wants. They come into nursing, you know, the vast majority of them, for the same reason that I did, for the same reason that all of you who are nurses sat here today did. So, you know, that hasn't changed. They also said we wouldn't be able to recruit. Well, of course we could recruit and recruit well. And they also said it would damage the widening participation agenda, but it hasn't. And in fact, we are the group that, you know, has the highest widening participation rate. But what are the benefits of having a degree level? Well, a European study looked at patient outcomes between nurses who had a degree and nurses who don't, and they clearly demonstrated that patients have better patient outcomes and less mortality rates with nurses who are graduates. So also it's nurses who are adaptable and have had enhanced clinical judgment and compassionate leadership. Now that's not to say that all of the nurses who are my age and maybe haven't got a degree don't have these things, but what we want is to get that from the beginning rather than have to get it developed over years of time. And so this was our person-centred graduate nurse curriculum, which is a curriculum that my colleagues from nursing are still implementing. I also did another funded project with Sue Ashby, who I don't think's here tonight, actually, I can't see her. Oh, she is, yeah, there she is, sorry Sue, I didn't see you there. Well, we looked at mapping how we could step on and step off a nursing programme to allay the fears, really, wasn't it, around whether it would mean widening participation was affected. So then we move on to sort of more recent times, and this is just, you know, we were in a culture now, in a system where there's lots of talk about nurses not caring, lots of talk about not having compassion, having poor leadership, and so from that I started to work around resilience. And this is just a definition that I quite like. So Wagnall, who's done a lot of work around this, says that most of us are ordinary people. However, every one of us has extraordinary possibilities and strengths. Everyone stumbles and falls from time to time, but each of us has the capacity to get back up and carry on. And we call this ability to get up and get going resilience. Some of the key themes from the literature is really around, you know, what is resilience, the real notion that self-efficacy and self-confidence is integral to developing resilience, that it's needed. Resilience is definitely needed in today's health service, really, not just nursing, but that we needed to design our programmes to help actually incorporate conflict. So we did a study, and Pat is here, I think, yeah. Pat has been a close project colleague working on me with this, and then other members of the school helped actually implement the interventions. But we chose a resilience scale, and then we developed a confidence scale of our own. And to inform the confidence scale, we did some focus groups with qualified nurses, third-year nurses and service users. And then phase 2, what we actually did with the students is we got them to complete the resilience scale on the confidence scale, and they would then be given a score, and then they'd be given a sort of roundup of, in brackets of scores, what their level of resilience and confidence would look like. We then did a whole range of really exciting learning and teaching activities, and I think Nikki's here somewhere who was again very involved in that. I can't see Nikki now, but she is here. I've seen her earlier. And then we did the scales again to see, and had some immediate evaluation. And from that, we're now developing a model. These are the things that we included in our confidence scale, and I thought it might be useful to just share some of the things with you that had come from the focus groups around what students might find challenging. So the idea of this is, I didn't want to just look at general resilience of an individual. I wanted to look at how could we make our curriculum help students cope with the challenges they will specifically find in practice. So the educational interventions included all sorts of things, but we did mindfulness sessions with them, we did sessions around knowing oneself, you know, we did some simulations using actors, and a number of different things. And the top 6 things that participants identified as having little or no confidence in is breaking bad news, being asked to undertake care that's not in the patient's best interest. And that relates right back to Francis, doesn't it? Because, you know, that's where some of the issues are. Students feel maybe vulnerable about questioning the practice they're seeing. Dealing with cardiac arrests, well, fair enough. I think that would, you know, you'd understand that one. Also, when their knowledge is being tested within the clinical environment, but being tested maybe in a way that's a bit inappropriate, because it makes them be, you know, look silly or be humiliated. An unexpected clinical emergency or an unexpected patient deterioration. And what we found is that using some targeted interventions around managing challenging situations and building their own self-confidence meant that we were able to increase their confidence. So what we're doing now is just finalising, aren't we, Pat, our model for building resilience. But what we know is that it needs to be spiralled throughout the programme. It needs to include learning and teaching activities that promote resilience. It needs to facilitate supportive relationships, that's crucial. And it needs to focus on confidence building. So here, I've just shown what it might look like, but self-assessment, facilitated learning, clinical experience, reflective practice, a deeper understanding, and then deeper resilience. These are some of the activities that from all the literature we've pulled together through literature review to say these are what the evidence says are the right type of activities to put in your educational programmes. And this is our model, which has got various things in it, but leadership and empowerment, advocacy, challenging situations, communication, etc. So lots of different things in there. So where are we now? Well, healthcare environments are now having to try and move from a separation to an integration. We've got a global shortage of nurses. We have got a global consensus of what nursing is, but we've still got a continued debate about what makes a good nurse. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of that. We now have to have formal revalidation as nurses, and I did mine this year, so I've done my revalidation. And we've got a continued debate about how to educate nurses. And lots of new roles coming out. And the other big thing that's happened this year is the NHS bursary has been removed. So for the first time, nursing, midwifery and allied health professional students have to pay the student nine and a bit £1,000, and they don't get an NHS bursary to support their living. So what do we do well in universities? Because this is also about promoting that. I think we facilitate knowledge accumulation and application. We promote and embed evidence-based practice. We establish the foundations for lifelong learning. We develop reflective practitioners. We develop a professional identity and values, and we do that from day one. We're quite, clear with our students that you've entered a profession and you have to behave like that. We provide a safe environment for developing skills and understanding the patient's perspective, and we get them to work in partnership with communities and groups, and they do an awful lot of really interesting stuff that's volunteering and things like that with local communities. We're student-centred, and we're starting to use loads of technology, but not just for the sake of it, but because it can enhance learning. And one of the things you can really use it well for is to give the patient's perspective. And so one of this photograph here is someone wearing the Oculus Rift glasses, and inside that is a video around from an autistic child's perspective. So we're working on things like that and we're working with the trust actually, going out there, videoing and doing things that will really enhance. And then this slide, I just wanted to show the numbers that are leaving is greater than the numbers actually that are joining the NMC register at the moment. So we do need to be lobbying for more. We need our placement providers to help us increase their placement capacity so they can take more, because it's only going to get worse if we don't do something about it. One of the other interesting pieces of work that I've not been part of, but I think it's worth sharing, is the work by Kerry Jones, and she's looked at the generational needs and implications, and young people today are very different to when I was young. Their view of careers and what they want, they don't see something as a lifelong thing. They're much happier to say, well, I'll do that for a few years and then I'll have a career change. So we need to, as NHS and HEI professionals, think about that and think what that means for us. But what we know, it's about getting the balance right, the type, the quantity, the quality, the support and the succession. So there's a new proposal out now. We're going through another review of nursing education, and it's going to change it again. So my colleagues in the School of Nursing are busily working on this at the moment. It's out for consultation, but we have to implement it this September. In September 2018. It's only out for consultation now. So you can imagine what that's going to do to the team, and they'll all be, very stressed looking in a few months' time when the consultation closes. But what it does do is says that we need the assessment of physical and mental health and cognitive ability for all fields of nursing throughout the programme. They have pillars of knowledge areas. They want students to be prescribing ready at the point of registration. And I know there's colleagues from pharmacy here, colleagues from medicine here, and that might worry them slightly, but that's what they're doing. So we have to get ourselves ready for that. They've now said we can use more simulated hours, and I think it's going to possibly be about 600. And the big change for our NHS colleagues is they are splitting the mental role into two separate things. So they will be having assessments and supervision roles separately. And they're talking about a national clinical assessment at the, throughout the programme. So what do we need to do in the future? Facilitate stimulating and high quality educational experiences that meet the changing needs of health, whatever that change is going to be. Keep the patient central to our endeavour. That's absolutely crucial, that whatever we do, it has to be about ultimately the patient. But we've got to support students. We should treat them in the way we would want to think they would treat our patients, because by treating them well, they will treat others well. We have to recognise the contribution of everybody, really, and that's why we do a lot more work with user groups and patients and carers. And we need to enable students to gain knowledge, skills and behaviours that are transferable and adaptable to changing needs. But we've got to lay that foundation for leadership and expert practice now. We've got to start doing that. And we have to work with each other. We can't be seen as these professional boundaries and sometimes silly nonsense about, well, I'm a this or I'm a that. Nurses are probably one of the worst for actually having that sort of belief. We've got to get rid of that and see we're here to work together to actually be doing the right thing for patients. So for me today, obviously my journey's been an interesting one. I've had a fantastic career so far. I hope it carries on for quite a bit. But, and I've met some amazing people along the way, some amazing patients who stick in my mind and will never be forgotten. But I just wanted to say thank you to a few people. My mum and dad and my family, they've been amazing to me. All the colleagues I've worked with, and most people won't know Margaret Crotty, but Pat knows who I mean. And she was the first person to give me a leadership role, and I think she died not very long afterwards, didn't she really? But so she was the head of the United Midlands College of Nursing. And then Rebecca Jester, who used to be the head of school here at Keele for nursing and midwifery, and got me to come over and join Keele. And then Andy Garner, who was the Dean of the faculty until he retired in January. And Andy always believed in me and supported me and pushed me forward. So, all the colleagues, all the friends and colleagues that I've worked with over the years, it's been, many of them have helped me. There's been times when life has been difficult and colleagues have been there for me. And then finally, I just want to thank my husband Andrew, and my children, Richard and Charlotte, both of whom are here, and both of whom are university students. So it's been a very interesting experience to be with them and see what their journey's been like. But actually, they've had to put up with the most, because getting to somewhere like this doesn't come easily. There's a lot of hard work and a lot of times when maybe I, wasn't able to be at home when they might want me to be at home, or poor old Andrew's had to cope with them while I'm away for a few days, and he's got his own busy job and all the rest of it, and we've got a dog at home as well, so that's an extra bit. And a cat, sorry, don't forget the cat, Charlotte. So, for me, they've been absolutely fantastic, and I wouldn't be here without them. And so that's my journey, really, and thank you very much for listening.